OWS fam, the nation, my dudes and dudettes. Hilow here, bringing you another installment in the 1 week season Best Ball Plus Industry Experts series. You know the drill by now. You're going to see us live on YouTube and Twitter every Friday. If you want to get access to the rest of what we're doing in Best Ball Plus at 1 week season, head on over to oneweekseason.com. Get signed up for the Best Ball Plus product. Now at a reduced rate, only $99, going to get you access to 90 one-on-one training sessions where we're going to train your decision-making process in best ball. With that, you see it on the screen. We are joined today by a contributing member of the OWS fam. And spoiler alert, we're not going to get too far into it, but you might see some more work from Mr. Papy this season at 1 week season. So without further ado, Papy, how we doing today, brother?
Hey, what's up, guys? Drafting and living, pretty much what I've been doing for the last 3 months. And just another day in draft paradise is my favorite time of the year.
Heck yes, dude. And speaking of that, kind of where have you been attacking and how many best ball drafts are you through so far?
I mean, I'm more of a guy who likes the early draft window a little bit, and I draft the whole time. I just finished relatively recently, and I still have some more FFPC drafts to do. But I'm through 150 on DraftKings, 150 on Underdog, so I got 300 in the book. I think about 8 on FFPC, best ball, and then a main event and some other yearly leagues over there. So I'm 300 plus drafts deep, at least 3 cups of coffee deep. I'm right where you want me.
Beautiful, dude. And you mentioned FFPC. Have you thrown any bullets into the 35 Superflex best ball?
No, I'm not in that one. Just their regular $125 best ball slim, I think they call it. I don't even know why they call it slim. There's no fat league, as far as I know.
Well, I think their initial best ball offerings that they had over at FFPC were 28 rounds. So their slim, I think, is 20.
Yeah, 20 is the one. 28 is good. I'm glad they slimmed it down. I'm not.
Yeah, you like them slim.
I have too many drafts to be living a 28 round life.
Yeah, dude, for sure. Yeah, that's cool. Have you attacked weekly winners at all over on Underdog?
No, only thing I've done on Underdog is the Best Ball Mania for last year. I did 150, and this year I'm doing 150. Year before that, I think I did 100. So last year was my first year max entering, which was a great year. I had 60th overall in the regular season. I think was my highest placing team, and I got one team through to the finals. I think I learned a lot. There's a lot to reflect on. A lot I think I'm doing better this year. So hopefully do a better result this year. I had good high-end teams, but my advance rate was only average. It was like 16-17%. So that's just average. So I think there's room for improvement there. So really excited to see how it goes this year.
Now, when you talk about some things you learned, I'm going to ask you like the broad question of what are some of the things you're instituting. But before I do that, what was your process for time period where you were drafting last year versus this year? Did that change at all?
Yeah, a little bit. So it's such a hard question because when you look at ADP, it's definitely softest earlier in the year, but with that goes that you have more uncertainty. So there's a lot more room to make mistakes too. So I think if you look at the data, I think more high scoring teams actually do come from the later draft window, and some people hang their hat on that. I look at it and say, if ADP is a little bit softer in the beginning of the year, I have to hold myself to a higher standard and think I can do a better job than average earlier and take advantage of that. And I actually think that this past year, I don't think I did a very good job of that. I mean, when I looked back at my teams that I drafted in the earlier draft window, even though the one that, did very well, I think was on the earlier side. But when I looked back at the majority of them, I didn't like them. If I looked through like my first 30 teams right now, if I was looking back, I would say I don't really like my first 30 teams. I think I made a lot of mistakes in there. There's a lot of guys who aren't what I thought they were going to be already. Now, when I'm looking back at like my first 30 teams this year, I mean, I'm like in love with them. I mean, I think that I got almost all the things that I was predicting happened in terms of the signings and some health issues for people. And even as recently as today, Joe Mixon being found not guilty, free Joe Mixon, right? Like that was good news for me. So I think I did a good job when I look back at those earlier teams. I think that's going to be a big difference in my teams this year.
Yeah, so something we've talked about in the past is when you're drafting in that early window with so much variance and so much uncertainty and ambiguity associated. I mean, this contest opened before we even had the schedule. So like talk about that is peak uncertainty, ambiguity. How were you approaching that in terms of like your overall game plan and draft strategy. I'll give you an example. On my end, I was looking to embrace as much uncertainty as possible. So I was targeting like I was adapting like an ultra exploitative kind of draft strategy where it was like Joe Mixon. You mentioned him earlier. I was drafting Joe Mixon heavily, but I was trying to figure out and think through like how can I draft Joe Mixon that could not be possible for the rest of this draft cycle. And what that kind of led me to is a bunch of Joe Mixon teams where Joe Mixon was my first running back or my second running back on a team in the 6th, 7th round, as opposed to now he's going to be maybe pushing the 2-3 turn by the time all is said and done. Are there any examples of kind of how you took like what your mindset was when you're drafting early with respect to that like variance piece? Were you like getting your guys? Were you kind of spreading exposure? How did you handle that?
Yeah, so in a similar line of thinking, I was looking for what you would call high variance, basically, or uncertainty, and trying to embrace that and say, who do I think is going to, by this time right now, be 2 or 3 rounds higher? Joe Mixon fit the bill for me because at the time, very early, there were concerns about him even possibly getting cut, his legal concerns, but I kind of just said, in my own mind there, my thinking was, well, if the Bengals haven't really added anybody, I'm going to take that as my sign. They don't think, these things are going to be a big deal. And then, of course, it could have gone the other way, but it played out where basically he takes a pay cut. And, he's found not guilty today. And look, he'll probably end up being, like you said, around the 2-3 turn. And I have a lot of teams with him as even a third running back, but a third running back where I drafted him maybe in, 75 or 76. And so I think that was, definitely a win. I think another guy for me that same line of thinking that I have a lot of was Williams, Javonte Williams out of Denver.
Yeah.
I was just, I know everyone just called him J.K. Dobbins. I mean, that was what you heard. That was the theory, right? Oh, it's this J.K. Dobbins year. Every injury is different. And if you've played a lot of sports, you've been around a lot of sports, every injury is different. And when I was reading about it, just again, all the tea leaves to me were saying they think he's healthy. They brought in Perrine, who again is a nice player, but if you look at Sean Payton and Joe Lombardi teams, they always like to kind of have 2 running backs like that. So I don't think that was like a huge warning signal. And they didn't draft anybody. They didn't really pursue anybody they could have signed so far, at least any of the running backs. And so now you see, well, they've been telling you he's healthy really this whole time. People didn't believe him. He seems like he is. He's practicing. He's going to play the second preseason week. I mean, at this point, if they're going to play him in the preseason, you kind of have to believe he's healthy. And if he's healthy and plays week 1 in, a Peyton Lombardi offense, and you just look at what those running backs have done from Kamara to then Eckler with Lombardi, now they're back together again. I mean, they haven't really had many seasons in the last 5 to 10 years where they haven't put a running back in the RB1 territory. And again, he's the exact prototype of like a Kamara or an Eckler for that role. I just don't see any reason it won't be in that role. And to me, being able to draft him, where oftentimes I even got him outside of the top 100, I think is just stealing. And so I drafted a lot of him early. And so I think that, he looks good. And again, just other injury ambiguity was another spot that I tried to attack. Different like stacks that I don't think I would be able to get now. Like I have an early team with a double Dolphins, Hill and Waddle and Tua. But the running backs that I ended up getting on that team, I think I have like Henry and Mixon and Williams. I think those are my top 3 running backs. And it's like I look at that team and I'm like, wow, I have like the Dolphins double here. And I think my third receiver is like McLaurin, and I have Beckham. I got lucky that game stacks in week 17. It was before the schedule was out. So, I'm looking at like a team like that and saying, wow, how do you have, like Henry and Mixon and Williams, who in my mind could all really finish in the RB1 territory if it breaks that way. They all have that range of outcomes for sure. And you still have a passing stack like the 2 Dolphins. I don't know. I'm kind of in love with the earlier teams this year. I didn't feel that way last year.
Yeah, and there's obviously going to be some misses. When you brought up the Denver backfield, and I think the way that I was handling the early ambiguity is identifying like team running back rooms where I thought that they were going to vastly outperform where their early ADPs were. So like it was Miami, it was Denver, it was Washington. And what I was doing early, like the first 3 days of the contest after, like late April, early May timeframe, was attacking those backfields, either pairing both of them, so like saying I don't need to be right here, or taking the cheapest one. So that led me to extreme ownership on guys like Antonio Gibson, Samaje Perine, Jerick McKinnon, who was going undrafted a lot of the time, and Jeff Wilson. So like identifying like backfields that could hold value and then saying like I'm not going to pretend to know what's going to happen. I'm just going to target the cheapest guy. And then as we 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, we started seeing the shift where it's like the field started waking up to Antonio Gibson and his ADP leapt Brian Robinson. Same thing in Denver. Samaje Perine and Javonte kind of converged their ADPs for a while. So at that point, it was like, okay, I got my exposure to the cheap ones. And those guys ended up flipping ADP. So now it's like I can take Javonte now that the ADPs are together. Now I can take Brian Robinson because their ADPs flipped in Washington. And then it's like, sorry, I just continue to take Jeff Wilson because he's a baller. So I've just been hammering him. How did that work out for your personal exposure? And I want to say, you've maxed the BBM already?
Yeah, I've already maxed it.
Okay.
So just finished maxing it like a couple days ago.
So how did that work out with your exposure? If you were kind of adopting this exploitative mindset early, did you like, what is your highest ownership on individual players?
Yeah, so my highest ownership at running back is actually, and you mentioned the Miami backfield, is Devin Achane. And that was kind of the same thing as trying to embrace that. And I drafted a lot of Devin when his ADP fell because people were worried Cook was going to go there. And so I was just like, give me even more. I had him before that and I just kept drafting him. And I think he's my highest owned running back at 46%. And my next two highest guys are Williams and Mixon, who I both are right around, I think, the low 30s. And then after that, I have Chubb, who is around 20. I was drafting Chubb in the 24th, 25th overall. I mean, I have some early teams with like him, Mahomes, and Jefferson that feel cool. Because you can't really do that. Because you can't, I mean, it's just like maybe I'll get the RB1, wide receiver 1, QB1. But so I have a lot of Chubb. Someone who am I forgetting? James Cook was the other one who I'm 20% on. So those are my top 5 running backs, and really they all, for the most part, have come up and improved their ADP from where I was drafting them. And Achane obviously is speculative, but I just think he has a lot of upside. But if you want to know my highest owned player, that'll segue into me talking about who I think is a really unique opportunity in the history of the NFL to me, or very recent history of the NFL to me. And it's not just the player; it's really the whole offense. Romeo, my man Romeo Dobbs, is actually my highest owned player. I own him about, I think, 59% or so. And I was drafting him, when he was 150, 160, all the way up into, where he is now. And Jordan Love is my highest owned quarterback at 49%. Now I have him as a backup on virtually every team. So it's not as if he's my starter. I have a lot of the top 3 and Herbert as starters. But I think the Packers passing attack in particular, I think presents a unique opportunity in the NFL in recent history. And I say that because people are drafting them, in my opinion, or have been drafting them at their absolute floor. Jordan Love has sat in the NFL for 3 years. And what is the last time somebody has sat that long in the NFL? We probably all remember it, right? It was Aaron Rodgers because it was the same team. And you just don't see that in the NFL. Everyone is drafting him as if he's a rookie, in my opinion. And he's not. He's been there for a lot longer than people realize, and he was a first round pick. I mean, if you look at him and what I saw when I've watched every single one of his snaps, if you look at least what I'm seeing, I see a guy who can play in this league. And if you look at his measurables, he certainly has the size. His 40 time, he runs a 4.7. Some guys that ran similar 40 times, I mean, Patrick Mahomes was a 4.8, Josh Allen was a 4.7, Aaron Rodgers was a 4.7. I mean, his 40 time comparable is in the range of guys who really threaten you with their legs, but don't have to overpower you with just their legs. And I see him, again, with so much opportunity with all of his receivers. Musgrave, I've been drafting aggressively. Watson, I've been drafting aggressively. Reed, I've been drafting aggressively. And I have Packers stacks all throughout my portfolio. And then when you look at their schedule as the final piece, they play such a cupcake schedule, especially against the pass. I think that all of those guys are being drafted at their floor. I think at least somebody is going to vastly outperform their ADP. I hope they all do, but I think the Packers passing attack is really a place I'm going after this year.
Yeah, I mean, look at my backdrop. You can probably guess I have I have a bunch of Packers as well. I'm a Pack
Oh
fan.
yeah, I see
Um,
that.
yeah. I I agree. And what I've seen out of camp, what I saw the first preseason week is my read on the situation is that Watson might be if we're looking at median outcomes, Watson is probably the guy that is being overdrafted. But if you look at one, his playoff schedule for best ball, and two, what he's done versus the defenses, like the defensive schemes that he's going to see in the playoffs, which is primarily ultra aggressive and cover one type, they're going to be amongst the top 5 teams in cover one. And look at his numbers, what he did as a rookie against man coverages, and it's asinine. Like he was top 12 in a lot of metrics against man coverage last season as a rookie. And I would agree with Jordan Love. And I was attacking that team in that situation heavily simply for the fact that they were so damn cheap. You could do a lot.
So
Like
cheap.
it was like Christian Watson was the only player being drafted in the top 10 rounds. Well, I guess, and Aaron Jones. Outside of that, it's like it was Christian Watson, then Aaron Jones, then AJ Dillon. And like the pass catchers were like just in no man's la la land in the back of the draft. So it's like, and then what I saw from the preseason week 1 game was Christian Watson was basically drawing routine blanket and double coverage. People like teams are probably going to play him differently than they did last season, where it was like he was not receiving alpha treatment. I think that's going to change this year. I think he kind of put the league on notice last year. We kind of saw that in week 1 preseason where he was drawing blanket coverage by the safety. He was getting help. He was basically, they were showing Jordan Love 2 high looks and they were giving Watson that cheat treatment from the strong side safety. So if that's the case, Romeo Doubs, Luke Musgrave, and maybe even Reed have that opportunity if Watson is going to get alpha treatment. All 3 of those guys have the opportunity to do some significant damage in a like over the span of a single week at any point this season. So that's what really stuck out to me. And I think Doubs is a guy that he's very polarizing, I think, by the industry this year. And I'm just like, everything is setting up for him. And I even wrote it up in my preseason week 1 breakdown, and I put it in the podcast for Best Ball Plus peeps that like I would not be shocked at the end of the season if Doubs and Watson were like lockstep, hand in hand in touchdowns. I think Doubs has a chance to score more touchdowns than Christian Watson this season. And that's like a spicy as hell take right now, but that's what I'm seeing. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, as much as I like Reed and Musgrave and Watson, and I probably have all of them in the 20% range. I think Musgrave, I have high 20%. I think Watson, I'm around 20. I think Reed, I'm around 20. But Doubs, I'm up around 60. And
Yeah.
I think that's because of them. I just think he's the most misvalued of the group because I totally agree with you that if he outscores Watson, which, by the way, I don't think is likely, but if he did outscore Watson, even just in fantasy points in general, not even just touchdowns, it wouldn't totally shock me. It wouldn't.
Yeah. Like you'd
I
be
think,
surprised, but
yeah, right. Like I'd be surprised, but it wouldn't like totally give me a heart attack and die from the shock, right? How in the world did that happen? And I think that what people aren't really necessarily paying enough attention to is that they're kind of telling you that out of Green Bay. I mean, they've said often all throughout camp, all throughout spring, like Doubs is kind of his go-to guy. And again, that's not to say because of the type of targets Watson will get and because of his ability, he won't still outscore him. But Doubs could see the same amount of targets as Watson, and it would just not be shocking. He could see more targets, really. I mean, if they developed almost into like a Keenan Allen and Mike Williams relationship, which I hope they don't, because I don't want all that Mike Williams on my team with the way that they use him down there. But if it developed into something like that, where it was like Watson basically the deep guy, takes the deep and intermediate shots, but the majority of the volume ends up going to Doubs underneath. I mean, that could happen. There's just a lot of opportunity there. And to see the draft capital that you had to invest to get Love and Dobbs stacked together, especially early in drafts, it was just basically nothing.
Yeah.
And and so I just did a lot of it.
Yeah, I was just looking up my ownership. Dobbs is my seventh highest owned wide receiver at 26%. And the viewers watching this, they're probably listening and hearing 60% a single player, or even 26% as my seventh highest owned wide receiver. Talk to me a little bit about your methodology and handling this kind of very, very narrowed in approach and game plan when variance was so high early in the draft season. Was that a conscious effort? Were you worrying about exposure levels? How are you kind of handling that?
Yeah, so I was and I wasn't. I do worry about exposure levels to some extent. I also do take stands. When I say Dobbs, my highest owned player overall, and I think he's 59%. I don't think I have another player above 50, and I think I maybe only have one other player above 40. So pretty much everybody else is 30s and down. Dobbs was obviously a guy who I thought was very misvalued, and I wanted to take that opportunity, to do over and over again. And so when you look at exposure, like, yes, it's important, but at the same token, if you think you're right, then act like you're right. I guess I'm willing to be wrong. Like, I've had a player like Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a good example of a player last year who I reflect on, and I wish I would have had a different way of thinking, because he was a player I drafted aggressively. I think I had maybe like 50% of him or something like that. He's one of those couple of guys that get up there in that range for me in ownership. And then I wanted him because I wanted the Chiefs running back. I thought whoever this Chiefs running back is going to have huge opportunity and could win leagues. Well, what happens? McKinnon and Pacquiao, are guys who are that guy, and Edwards-Helaire does nothing. And so what was the lesson to learn there was, hey, you had the backfield right, but you spent high draft capital on the guy who you thought was going to be the leader of an ambiguous backfield. Spend low draft capital on it, right? Draft, the McKinnon of this year. And that's something that, I tried to do a lot better this year, was to, spend lower draft capital on ambiguous backfields, not just say, well, I think this guy is the guy right now. Of course, that leads you back to the logic of, well, if you look at the Chiefs backfield, draft Clyde Edwards-Helaire again, you dummy. Which I had to do a little bit, even though I was like, what am I feel so stupid doing this. But that the thinking would tell you that he, would be the one you would look for if you're thinking that way in the Chiefs backfield this year. So, I think that was a lesson learned there, and something to think about. But yeah, as far as exposure goes, I do factor it in. But if I think I'm right, if I think somebody's misvalued, I'm going to keep doing it. I think Mixon was another example. That's why I have a lot of Mixon. I think Williams was another example. People who if I think it's wrong, it's wrong, and I'll live with my decisions on those. On those certain instances. There's probably other guys that I'm not on, as much, because I'm drafting, a lot of one guy here in certain spots. It keeps me off of. So that's the risk you take. You kind of have to also take some fade stances too. So it goes both ways.
Yeah. And how I kind of talking about along those same lines of like taking stuff that we've learned in the past and applying it forward. Last season, I maxed the BBM by like middle of June. It was like I was hammering the early, because I identified an edge that people were not treating variance in that early, very volatile stages of the draft window. They were not handling it correctly, as in basically it was trying to acknowledge that there's all this variance while trying to manage it and pretend that we could control it. Whereas I kind of went just highly exploitative. But what I learned was those thinkings were probably tailored to optimal theory, which is taking into account and trying to adopt a game plan to maximize expected value if we could simulate this season on an infinite timeline, which we know we can't. And that kind of leads into the fact that like we probably don't need anywhere near optimal in order to win the BBM or any of these other major contests that are out there. So what I did this year, and learning from that, is I basically split my planned entries this year, which is going to be about 1,000 drafts. Yeesh, that's a lot. I'm through about 750 right now. But I've spread those out, and primarily with the major contests, into 3 distinct draft windows. I allocated 50, for example, BBM entries for right after the NFL draft until the start of preseason camp, and then 50 between preseason camp and the start of the preseason, and then 50 for the start of the preseason towards the start of the NFL regular season. And by doing that, I think I can aggressively attack those different areas of the draft window, which are basically divided up by the amount of information we have, and be able to still take those aggressive stances, but now it's spread out into thirds where I can manage my exposure and portfolio in different ways. So, for example, how that played out is I ripped off my first 50 BBMs within the first 6 days of the BBM being open. And I was getting Jerick McKinnon in the 20th or the 18th round. I was attacking like guys like Dobbs, like you mentioned. I was attacking guys like Mixon, and I haven't drafted a single Mixon share over my subsequent 600 drafts after that time frame. And by like doing that, I was getting like 60% ownership to guys like Cooper Kupp early. I was getting 60% ownership to guys like Jerick McKinnon, Romeo Dobbs, Joe Mixon. And now, like my Joe Mixon exposure is at 18%. So if I don't take another Joe Mixon share and I only have a quarter of my portfolio left to draft, I'll still be above the field. But all of my exposure is 6th and 7th round because I was just like hammering that edge and doing it in a way where I knew that I still had the time to like adjust for the rest of the draft window to kind of balance my portfolio. Where that has led to some extreme ownerships for me is like Jeff Wilson is still at 33% for me. Marvin Mims is still at 31%. Rashad Bateman at 30%. And then my highest owned tight end is Jake Ferguson, because I saw that he was likeliest to play as the starting tight end in Dallas on an offense that we knew favored tight end production. And yes, there was that uncertainty. Was it because of Kellen Moore? He's no longer there. It was kind of like, is it Dak or is it Kellen Moore that it favors the tight end in Dallas? I was like, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know, but it's likeliest that Jake Ferguson is the starting tight end because Schoonmaker was injured. He missed OTAs. He missed portions of camp. He's a rookie. All these things kind of playing into like, Jake Ferguson is probably the dude. And now it wasn't until this week, like immediately following the first preseason game, that the field was like, oh shit, it's probably Jake Ferguson, right? So he's moving from like 18th round. I could see him going up into 12th, 13th round by the time all is said and done. But the point being is like, I was able to adapt and adjust my personal game plan to be able to still take advantage of what's most important to take advantage of when, but still kind of manage my portfolio and my risk spread out. What are your thoughts on that? And I don't know, I guess, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I did something similar. I mean, I started right away, like the first, week that you could, and I would do 5 drafts on DraftKings and 5 drafts on Underdog, and I would do them in blocks of 5, and I would rotate between the two. And part of why I was oscillating between the two was so that you could see the ADP differences between the two, and it helped you, see some of the inefficiencies that way. But going back and forth between the two, I think, and then spacing them out, right? So I would try not to I was like, okay, the most I'm ever going to do in a day right now is like 5, you know what I mean? And then I spaced it out. So it was like, okay, I did, so many in May, and did so many in June, so many in July. And then I just finished doing them, the last couple of days I finished on Underdog. So, and I wanted to time it so that I would be finishing at like the start of camp, right around now, because I have some other yearly drafts and stuff that I do a little bit later in this time. And also it's generally just kind of a personal busy time. So that's part of it too. But I also really like to get all my drafts done before the beginning of camp or right in the early camp. Because again, I think you can still capitalize on a lot of inefficiencies. I think by the end of camp, I think things get pretty tight. People pretty much know who's going to play where. And again, some people say that's right. It's an advantage to have that extra knowledge. It's tough to say, which way it is, which is why I like to space all my drafts out through like kind of the earlier ish window, but not draft so many. Like you said, you did like all 150 in June. I think that you just run too much risk maybe that way, where like there's just so, you get an injury and it's like, you couldn't adjust at all. So I think spacing
you draft
out,
Rob Gronkowski.
Well,
That's
yeah,
what
there
happened
you
to me
go.
last year.
Yeah, like that. You draft Rob Gronkowski, too much Rob Gronkowski, and then so yeah. I mean, this year I think that I'm pretty excited for how they've gone because, like I said, when I looked back at my drafts last year, I was disappointed with my first ones, and this year I think that they're actually a lot better. So, uh, yeah, I mean, I think that just spacing out your draft window is smart, but by the same token, if you do think you see something early, I mean, don't be afraid to draft 60% Dobbs. I mean, if you think you have a read on something, you might be right, and you'll feel worse if you're right and you don't do a lot of it
Yeah,
than
it's
if you're wrong and you do.
the old catch 22 in variant games is like, how do you manage that, and then how are you going to feel about that at the end of the day? And these are all personal questions. They're going to be different between everybody who you find an answer from, and that's kind of what I wanted to highlight since we've kind of gone down this path. Is everybody's game plan development is going to be different. See, when you look at game plan development through the lens of game theory, what are we taking into account? Well, we're taking into account our own personal knowledge. We're taking into account our knowledge of the games themselves. So like the structure, the payouts, all those things. And then we're taking into account our observations of the field. And those observations of the field are going to help influence our starting point or our assumptions that we base kind of our whole game plan development on. And that's going to be different from person to person. So I've been very vocal about like where my starting point assumptions were and how that led to my game plan development in this like attempt to make it relatable and to more or less portray that everybody's is going to be different. And that's why I was asking those like probing questions for you in particular, like how did you handle these things, which kind of go into your starting assumptions and how you base your game plan. So super interesting. Any other closing remarks on that?
No, I mean, I think that you should start in the very beginning, just with your assumptions, try to reflect on what you did well and what you didn't do well in the year past. I know that for me, a couple of things that I looked at when I looked at, my team that finished in the top 100 in the regular season, all three of these players were on it. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who I already talked about, right? I feel like that was a mistake. Keenan Allen, believe it or not, was on that team, drafted him in the third round. And when I look at him, it's like, do I think that was a mistake or do I think that was unlucky? Well, he was a pretty good player when he came back. He ripped up his hamstring for 10 weeks. I'll probably not take that one as hard as I took the Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And then a player that I got right a lot of was Jamal Williams last year, who, again, obviously he had incredible touchdown luck, but just the idea of taking somebody who was in like that role, who could get goal line looks, who was in a little bit of an underrated offense that had a role. I think maybe like a Tank Bigsby feels similar to me this year, who I have a lot of. I think just trying to look at, okay, well, I did that right last year. Who fits that type of mold this year? And then start with those assumptions and go from there. It's pretty much what I did.
Now let's transition the discussion to like a more roster construction discussion. We kind of know what has been proven to carry the highest efficiency, we'll say. It's very, very difficult and very nuanced discussion to talk about roster construction because I theorize that roster construction is most important to our advancement rate. But once we get into the single week playoff rounds, roster construction goes out the window. You're basically looking to score the most points in advance and then do it again and then advance and then see what happens in week 17. And knowing that like where all the primary contributor to expected value in these contests is to getting to week 17, because that's where all of our EV is basically coming from. But the second highest piece of that discussion, the second highest contributor to expected value in these contests, if you want to get the full breakdown, go check out oneweekseason.com. I've got the expected value broken down to the penny about where you can expect to make money in these contests. But the second highest contributor to expected value in these contests is advancement, is getting out of your draft and getting teams. And that was the piece that I was more or less neglecting last year because I was like, okay, let's optimize for week 17 where all the expected value is coming from. But neglecting the fact that the second highest contributor, which is super important, is getting out of your damn draft, which I did at a below average rate last year because I was drafting 1 tight end teams and 3 running back teams and kind of pushing the envelope of like what is theoretically optimal. But it's interesting from the comparison of what we are playing for in what area of these contests. Like we need roster construction to get out of our round. And then after that, it's kind of goes out the window, and we need single week range of outcomes players with correlations and stacks and all the things that we know is theoretically optimal, backed up by the data. So in that discussion, how were you approaching your roster constructions this year? Were you staying more in lane with like between 2 to 3 quarterbacks, 4 to 6 running backs, 7 to 9 wide receivers, 2 to 3 tight ends, or were you getting a little explorative, trying to optimize for the playoff rounds? How did you approach that?
Yeah, so I changed what I did a little bit. I think last year I pretty much just broke up like 3-5-7-3, 2-5-8-3 rosters, and used the majority of maybe those types of things. I never do a 4 tight end roster, although there are some that you can use. But this year,
Hashtag team never 4 tight ends.
yeah, I never do 4 tight ends. But this year, what I really did was, because I agree with you, I wanted to improve my advance rate. Last year, my advance rate was normal. I had good high-end teams, but I was 16, 17% advance rate. That's just normal. This year, even with the way they spread out the payments for the regular season, if you get a team up there, you're going to get something too. So even more of a reason to try to maybe care about the season and not just week 17. But I was very focused on 2-5-8-3 teams this year, which I think is the optimal. And again, there's a lot that are very close, but I think 2-5-8-3 is the overall optimal if you're going to split hairs roster construction to advance from your league. And so I was the majority of my teams are 2-5-8-3 teams. If I drafted a 3-5-7-3 team, it was not because I was like, you know what, I just want to have some 3-7-5-3. It was because I didn't get a quarterback I wanted. I decided I was going to go with 3 quarterbacks. I didn't get a tight end I wanted. I decided I was going to go with 3 tight ends. And so that dictated more when I did it this year, rather than, I think last year I was too like, oh, well, this one's going to be a 3-5-7-3 team because I want more 3-5-7-3 teams. This year it was just like every team's 2-5-8-3 at the beginning of the draft in my mind. And if I have to go one way or another, then I'll do that. I also did a couple more unique drafts this year. Like I did some 2-4-9-3s that I like. I did some 2-4-10-2s. Really, those two constructions: 2-4-9-3, 2-4-10-2, which I think are a little bit more aggressive version of the typical 2-5-8-3. And it's not that I did a lot of them, right? Because I didn't want to be like, all right, let's go ahead and do something that's slightly less than optimal roster construction wise, because we want to have a little more punch or be a little different. But I did do a little bit of them. And I think if you looked at the overall data, that's really what it makes sense to do with those types of rosters. Like you're hoping that it hits, and then you end up having something in the variance round that's a little different. But by the same token, you don't go crazy with it. So if it ends up not getting out of its league, okay. So I was much more regimented on 2-5-8-3s this year, because I really did think that, I want to get out of my league at an above average rate, not just an average rate, because once you get into the high variance rounds, anything could happen. And last year, my team that made it to the finals, I had one team that got through to the semifinals, right? So I had like an average advance rate. One team went through the semifinals, and then it won the semifinals first out of 16 and went through to the finals, right? So that's kind of just shows you the variance there. You can have one team get through to the semifinals and maybe it advances, but if you just get a ton of teams through, anything can happen.
Yeah, interesting to hear you say that, because I kind of took the same approach. And last year, you talked about like your baseline from where to deviate. My baseline last year was 2-4-10-2. That was my baseline. And that's because I was going extremely exploitative early in the season when RB depth charts weren't broken out, when we had all this uncertainty. And my advancement rate was like 13%, so below average, which I had never done before. And it was very clearly because I was going full into this like theoretical optimal realm where I was just embracing all the variants. And now this year, my baseline going into a draft is 2-5-8-3, just kind of across the board. That's the assumption. And obviously it depends on positional salary or positional roster or positional ADP allocation, and other theoretical concepts and stuff, which we're not really going to get into this. But I'm interested to see how that influences my advancement rate, and then my performance in the playoffs should follow suit. I'm thinking is the kind of my assumptions. And whether I think some people might look at that as, Hilow, you're probably a year late because this was known last year that 2-5-8-3 was probably optimal. And my kind of counter to that is like, yeah, I knew it then, and I was just accepting the increased variance. So it's different to make a mistake or have a reason for why you're making a deviation. And that's something we've hammered on in Best Ball Plus a lot this season is like deviations are good. Like deviations generate leverage, but they also through the like the definition of what a deviation is and does, it's going to be a hit to your expected value in the snapshot of that singular roster and throughout an entire portfolio. But deviations can also generate expected value through leverage. And if the leverage or the if the expected value gained from the leverage through that deviation outweighs what you lose from the deviation itself, now that's a boost to expected value and something you can look to build into leverage. So that was like long and convoluted, but that was kind of my approach, how my approach changed from last year going to this year. And I'm interested to see kind of how that works out. Yeah. Any rebuttal or thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I totally agree. And that's my biggest point of what I'm trying to improve is in my advance rate. So
Yeah.
I want to see well above an average advance rate. I don't think there's any reason not to have a well above average advance rate. So, we'll see how it goes this year. But yeah, 2583 is certainly my foundation this year.
Yeah, and I would I think it is definitely theoretically that doesn't make sense. It's theoretically should increase our advancement rates because roster construction is the primary contributor to advancing out of your round because we can't control things like injuries, variance, depth chart stuff, all that stuff. But we can influence when and where we're allocating the finite resources of draft picks that we have to given teams. And in doing so, now we kind of look to manipulate the individual range of outcomes, the correlation, the stacking, getting all that built into the baseline kind of assumption of we're trying to optimize for advancing first, and then we're trying to optimize for playoff performance, which is the single range outcomes, the correlation, the stacking, all those things. Yeah, I dig that. We've gone through 45 minutes almost already, dude. That was fast and furious. So I want to toss it over to you. Do you have anything that you want to discuss? Because we try and keep these to an hour. So we got about 15 minutes left. You have anything you want to discuss or questions or things that you want to shake out or things that you've been dying to hash out?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two things we didn't really talk about people that I faded. I have
let's talk about that.
I have two at least, I guess, relatively bold fades. Well, one looks good now, which was Bryce Hall. I was really not on Bryce Hall at all. I think I have him on 2 out of 150 lineups. Brees. Yeah. Brees. Sorry, calling him Bryce. Brees Hall.
Okay. Same page.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Yeah, same. You know who I mean. The guy who runs the ball for the Jets.
Yeah. I have 3% currently.
So then you weren't on him really either. And
correct.
I love Javonte Williams, and people said, well, why did you want one guy who was injured and the injury from the other scared you away? But it was more than just the injury. First, it was the way that the teams were acting, and second, it was even the whole offense. I am not sold on the Jets offense as a whole. I'm not sold on Aaron Rodgers. I'm not sold on Garrett Wilson because I'm not sold on Aaron Rodgers, at least at his ADP. I think Garrett Wilson's a fine player, but at his ADP, I'm not sold on the whole Jets offense. I could see that whole offense being a slow moving. Aaron Rodgers always plays slow offense that just I think they're all their ADPs are too high because of Rodgers, in my opinion. And so I'm definitely off of the Jets by and large. I mean, again, I have a little bit of them, maybe 2 or 3%, but like nothing. And so I was really happy to see Cook go there, obviously, because it just makes that whole thing a mess. And he could have gone to the Dolphins where it would have hurt me. He could have gone other places where it would have hurt me. So that was great that he went there. And here's another guy that I'm fading that I'm sure we'll get some disagreement. I do not like St. Brown. I don't like him. I'm not on him.
All right, well, that's going to be all for us for today, guys. It's been great. We'll see.
No, I'm sure I'd get some disagreement from most people on the Sun God, and he has a really cool name. He's the Sun God. It's hard. You're sitting there, you see him, you're like, I'm not gonna have any of the Sun God. I'm gonna hate myself. I just don't see a big difference between him and Keenan Allen, honestly. I don't. They're the same type of player for me, except Keenan Allen has a better offense and a better quarterback, and I can draft him 3 rounds later. I really think that he's busty as Jamal Williams, or is it Jamal Williams? I see Jay Williams on everything that I draft him. I don't even know his first name. Jameson Williams. So you see, he's got to play so I can remember his name. Jameson Williams, even though his much of a bust as he looks, like right now, I do think when he comes back, he could take a large portion away from what St. Rod has, basically, because he thrives on volume. I mean, if he doesn't get crazy volume, I think that he could be a bust. So I'm not on him. I think the Lions are going to run a lot this year. I just, I'm not. And again, I could be right. It's not as if I faded him. I didn't totally fade. He's like a 5% player for me, though. He's definitely an underweight player.
Yeah, it's gross, dude. No, I'm
just
kidding.
No,
I started. Amon-Ra was a guy that I was undecided. So I kind of, when I'm not trying to take an ultra aggressive stance on a player, I typically like to keep them around average, so around the 7 to 9% range, because I know that like I'll always have the chance to adjust from there. If I need to increase that, it's very easy to do so now that I'm already at 7 to 9%. If I need to decrease, same story. It's very easy to do that. Guys like Breece Hall, where I felt like he was both being drafted over his median projection, and all of the uncertainty kind of weighed into that discussion as well. He was a guy that I was very easy saying, like, he's highly unlikely to increase in ADP. I'm fine being an almost 0 here. That 3% that I have probably is over the last 2 days, to be honest, where he was going. I think the latest I've gotten on Underdog was like 54, pick 54. So in the 5th round, that's an area where I'm okay. I started sprinkling him in a smidge in the 4th round, but now that he's like sometimes falling to the 5th round, and his ADP is still at like 39. So it's not like he has fallen off the face of the earth, but like in the micro snapshot of a singular draft, you'll see him falling into the 50s every now and then. That's kind of where I'm looking to be like, okay, I'll get 3 to 5% maybe. But like, yeah, Amon-Ra was a player that early in the draft cycle, I was undecided, and I wanted to just keep him around the average 7 to 9%. Now that I've seen his, we'll save the discussion on camp footage for another day, because we should not be caring about camp footage at all. Yeah. But like, we should not, I'll put an asterisk to that statement. We should not be caring about camp footage that doesn't tell us anything. The camp footage I am seeing from Amon-Ra St. Brown tells me that he is a badass MFer, and he is a bona fide like route technician. He's able to win in close, and he's showing me alpha traits. And that is stuff that I honestly had not even seen last season watching him play. He hadn't shown me that yet. It was like he was a volume guy. Now I'm kind of like, bruh, this is a volume guy that is also elite. And so now I took that 7 to 9%. I'm at 14%, so I've almost doubled it. And he was a guy, even through that ambiguity and that like indecision early, he was a guy, like, I look back and I look at my early Amon-Ra St. Brown rosters, and some of them I'm like, holy fuck, dude, these are legit. Like, I think I had like a Cup, Amon-Ra, and then like Derrick Henry start. And it was like, damn, that is powerful right now. So yeah, different. And I think that is a different mindset than even like the ones and zeros binary outcome discussion, where it's like, I know best, I know what this player is going to be. It's like, not everybody or not every player you have to take that stance on. Maybe ones and twos, like you mentioned, like you mentioned 2 fades, maybe like onesie twosies. And I think that is valuable. And that is probably more valuable for the fades than it is for the targets and being overweight on people. But not every player, like, are you going to hit? How many players are you going to like nail this year? Maybe a handful? Like, yeah, fuck yeah, I was right about that guy. Maybe a handful. Anything beyond that is just asinine odds. It's just unlikely to happen. And so drafting as if you know exactly what's going to happen over the top 190 players in ADP or beyond, if you're exploiting the back half of the draft, is just insane to me. So like, I think it's okay to take these, like, I don't know, man, I'll just keep his ownership around league average, or just average, not league average, and then I can adjust it as I get more information. Are there players that you kind of took that stance on where you were like, I don't know, dude, but I want some?
Yeah, for sure, Sky Moore. I have a lot of Sky Moore, and I drafted most of him early, but then he was a player that I kind of started to see the tea leaves as he was getting more and more, reps in camp, and it seemed like he was going to be a bigger part of the offense. And I think I ended up with like 20% Sky Moore. So definitely a guy that I adjusted up on. Nico Collins is another one.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I had some of him early on just because ambiguity, who's, him, Michi, and Woods. I took a little bit of all of them. And then as I saw, okay, it looks like Nico's going to really be the guy here who might be the featured receiver. I adjusted him. I think I'm around like 15 or 16% Nico now. So definitely, adjusted him up. I think definitely those two stick out to me as probably guys that I did that with the most that I can think of. Really just said, I want some of them, but if I get some piece of news that says that, there's even more of a reason, I'm just going to up my percentage on them. In terms of going the other way, and again, when I say fade, like, St. Brown, I said I have 5% of them. It's not a strict fade, right? It's more of an underweight than it is a fade. And I think that there's only a couple of people that I would really like fade. And even them, I probably have on 2 teams or something like that, right? Brees Hall being an example of something I think I have on two teams, right? I would consider him like a fade. But what you were, to your point of like, you really just don't know. And I just remember like my team that got the highest up in the top 100, I had Tony Pollard on it, who was a guy that I was not big on last year, right? I should have been targeting that probably because there was more ambiguity there than I thought. But because I drafted him on that team being, I want 5%, 6%, I just don't want to have none of him. That team ended up doing really well with a guy that was not like a target for me in any way, but that you're just not always right. So it's definitely important to do that.
Probably my personal biggest shocking fade this season is probably Trevor Lawrence. And it's not a situation. I was off the tab, and I wanted to tab back to this to see your reaction. But Trevor Lawrence, it's not a situation of I think Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars are going to fail. Their offense is set up to do very, very well. It's more of a Doug Peterson and Press Taylor issue, and the fact that the field seemed to be lumping Trevor Lawrence into the tier 1 and high-end tier 2 quarterbacks when he was very clearly not in that tier for me. So the fact that he was being drafted around guys like Justin Herbert and Justin Fields for a long time, I was just like, there's no way that he's in the same stratosphere as those guys. So I'm okay going overweight the top 6 at the position and just saying like, sorry, Trevor, you're the first player in the tier that I don't want to be touching this year. So how do you feel about him or that kind of mindset?
I actually totally agree with you about Trevor Lawrence. I think, again, I have 2 or 3% of him, and Calvin Ridley would have been another one I could have brought up and said that I've just been out on because of where he's being, because I just think he's being drafted at his ceiling, and maybe he will be that good, but how good is he going to have to be to outperform second round, third round draft, high third round draft capital when he's just coming back into a totally new offense that's crowded? I just, I've been pretty much a hard pass again, 2-3% on all the Jaguars pieces. I'm really out on that whole passing game. I totally agree with what you said there, that he is not a Herbert or a Fields, or certainly not a Mahomes or an Allen or a Hurts or any of the guys that are really in the top tier for me. And he was being drafted really right around there. Like even I think 1 or 2 leagues I saw him go ahead of Burrow when Burrow strained his calf. And, so it's like stuff like that to me is just not, he's not that level. And so I've really let people load up on the Jags. I'm pretty far off. I think ETN I have maybe 10% of. He's maybe my most owned. Oh, I do have a decent amount of Tank Bigsby, actually. I have like 16 or 17% Tank Bigsby. But that, again, that's almost also because I don't have faith in the passing game, right? So I'm trying to maybe try to leverage that belief a little bit and say, well, let's just hope touchdown variance swings to the running backs too, and really makes the Jaguars passing game useless for other people, right? And I'll take some of those cheap touchdowns. Let's hope the variance goes that way for their backfield this year. So yeah, I'm out on the Jaguars passing game.
Yeah, I think I just looked it up. My top 3 exposure from the Jags are Tank Bigsby, Evan Ingram, and Zay Jones. So just like the cheap ones. It's like I'm still betting on that offense, like being okay. But I mean, what they showed us last season is like they're just going to rotate spike weeks basically, and nothing that has changed is indicating any differently. They just replaced Marvin Jones with Calvin Ridley. So like, I don't know, man. And they added a running back piece. So they have a ton. They're going to have a good offense, but it's likely going to be rather spread out. So that means like the median projections and their range of outcomes is going to be extremely wide from a weekly basis.
Yeah, totally agree. And just looking, I don't even have 10% ETN. So yeah, other than Bigsby, who I have a chunk of, I'm pretty much out on their whole offense, underweight on their whole offense. I think it's going to be spread out. I don't know where it's going. I'm hoping it goes to the cheap guy. And I think they're a little overrated. So.
Well, Papy, dude, we are already at an hour. That was awesome. Thank you for coming on. I'm going to give you the floor again. The floor is yours. Tell the peeps where they can find you. And if you want to hint at anything of what to expect coming up through OWS this season for you.
Yeah, it's always great to write for OWS. It's been one of the most fun things I've done the last couple of years. You guys can find me on Twitter at Papy324. And I think I'm going to do hopefully another article for OWS this year. So get in on the scroll with you guys. So you guys can be looking forward to that. Get to hear from me for kind of a whole slate topic rather than just, a one single game. So look forward to getting in there this year.
Hell yeah, man. We look forward to that as well. With that, we're going to get out of here. Again, this was Best Ball Plus from 1 week season. If you're interested in theoretical, conceptual, and analytical fueled knowledge for best ball, go check that out, oneweekseason.com. Get signed up for Best Ball Plus at now a reduced rate for the remainder, but you will get access to all the other sessions we've done this off season. So again, 90 one-on-one training sessions to better your best ball process and decision making. With that, I'm Hilow. He is Papy. We'll see you in the draft lobby.